מסכת חולין דף קוף זין אמר רב נוטל אדם את שתי ידיו שחרית ומתנה עליהן כל היום כולו. Rav says that one may wash his hands in the morning and stipulate that that will cover the entire day. Whenever he decides to eat bread, he will not have to wash again. And so rather than washing every time for every meal, just wash once in the morning and have in mind that that will be for all of the day's meals. אמר להו רבי אבינה לבני פקתא דערבות, כגון נתון דלה שכיחה לכו מיה, משו ידייכו מספרה ואתנו עליהו לכולה יומה. And Rabbi Abina told the people of the valley of Aravot, this is a place where there was very little water. He says, for example, you, where water is scarce, you should follow this advice and wash your hands in the morning and stipulate that this will cover the meal later on in the day, for the whole day. Some say that one can only follow this advice under circumstances, under pressing circumstances. However, if it's not pressing circumstances, then do not do that. And that would disagree with Rav. You see, Rav says you can do it. Rav says you can do it lechatechila. Even if you're in a place where there's lots of water, no problem. Look, you have to have your hands washed. That's the point. As long as your hands are washed and you have in mind the whole day and you make sure that your hands will not get tameh and will not get dirty, so you're keeping them safe. And so it doesn't matter. It doesn't have to be 1 minute before, 10 minutes before. It can be all the way in the morning, and that will cover the whole day. Rav says that lechatechila. And Rabbi Abina tells the people here where this was a difficult circumstance, and some say that you can only do it in a difficult circumstance against Rav. And others say that you can do it even not in pressing circumstances, and that would mean that would follow Rav's opinion exactly, that you can do it even lechatechila, even without pressing circumstances. Amar Rav Papa, Hai arita de dala'e en lotin memenu layadayim dela'atu mikoach gabra. Rav Papa teaches that an irrigation channel, so this means that there's a river or some water source, and then people are taking buckets and lifting the water up out of the river and pouring it into an irrigation channel. And a person wants to do netilat yadayim with the water in the irrigation channel by sticking his hands into that channel as the water flows. And so Rav Papa says you cannot do netilat yadayim in that way. Why? Because it's not flowing by the power of a human being. So we learn a new rule here that you cannot just put your hand under flowing water if it's only flowing because of a natural gravity. It has to be flowing by the power of a human being. And so that's why we use a cup, so that you take the cup and you fill it from the faucet, and then you take the cup and pour it so that it's being poured by human power, human initiative. Now, you don't have to be the one pouring it on yourself, and the way we do it, with one hand pouring on the other. You can have someone else pour it on your hands, as long as it's a person pouring onto your hands. Or you can, if you have like a pump or water wheel with your foot, you can push that pump with your foot, and then that will bring the water onto your hands. That's also okay, as long as it's coming from human power. And in this case, it's not coming from human power. Now, you might think it is, because a person has to take the water from the water source, from the river, and lift it up and then pour it into the ditch. So it is coming from the pouring of a person. The problem is that the person, you're not putting your water right directly under the bucket. That would be okay if it was directly under the bucket. You're putting your hands, immersing your hands into the channel, way down the channel. And by that point, it's not flowing because of the power of the human that first poured it in on top, but rather because of gravity that's pulling it. And so therefore, that is no good. It also will not work as a mikveh. A mikveh, if it's a kosher mikveh, you can dip your hands in. But this is not a kosher mikveh because it's mayim she'uvim. You took the water and you drew the water from the natural water source, and then you put it into this ditch, so it's an artificial or drawn water source. So therefore, this does not work from either law. However, if you put your hands into the channel right near the bucket where the bucket pours into it, well, in that case, it does come from the person's force, and then you can do nitilat yadayim with it. In other words, not obviously, if you put it into the flow from the bucket into the water, as the water is going down from the bucket into the channel, obviously that's good because it's being poured right on top. But even if you move away a little bit, and you put the hands inside the channel, and so that's after the bucket pours into the channel, and it lands in the channel, and then you put your hands right under, like 2 inches right under that. That's still moving from the force of the person. It still has some momentum from the pouring, and then that's okay. But if you go far from that spot, then there's no more momentum from the pouring. Then it's only because of gravity, and then that's not good. If the bucket has a hole in it, and it can't just be a tiny hole, it has to be a hole that's big enough that water can enter the hole from the outside, which is a slightly bigger hole than a leaky one that the water can go from inside to outside. So a small hole can let the water out, a slightly bigger hole can let the water in. Okay, so if one has a whole bucket like that, then you can immerse your hands in the channel. So imagine the case like this, where a person, let's say, standing like in the river, on top of the river, and he puts the bucket in the river and lifts it up. Now, as he picks it up, he has to, let's say, pick it up a few feet in order to then pour it into the channel. So the point is that the channel is too high, so he has to lift it up. Now, at the point that he's lifting it up, and he lifted it up and he's pouring it into the channel, there's also water that's leaking out of the bottom of the bucket. So that right at that moment, the hole and the stream that's leaking out of the bottom of the bucket is connecting the water in that bucket to the river. So it's all connected to the river, so it has the same law as the river. And then at the very same time, he's also pouring it out of the spout, the upper spout of the bucket, into the channel. In that case, all the water in the channel is effectively connected directly to the river, and therefore that extends the mikveh status of the river to the channel. And so we can say from the river to the stream, and one can dip one's hands into the channel, and that will act as a mikveh. ואמר רבא, כלי שניקב בכונס משקה, אין נותנים ממנו לידיים. And Rava said that if a vessel has a hole that's big enough that liquid can enter, you cannot use it for washing hands. So now we're just talking about a regular case where you're just in a sink, and the cup that you use has a hole on the bottom, and the hole is big enough not only to let water out, but big enough that water would come in if you would submerge it. So that you're not allowed to use. You have to use a whole cup, because otherwise it's not a proper vessel for use. ואמר רבא, כלי שאין בו רביעית אין נוטלין ממנו לידיים. Rava says further that a vessel that does not have a quarter log of water in it cannot be used. It has to have at least that much water in it. Ini, a contradiction. ואמר רבא, כלי שאין מחזיק רביעית אין נוטלין ממנו לידיים. Rava says that a vessel that cannot hold a quarter log of water cannot use it. המחזיק אף על גב דלת ב. So that means that the vessel just has to be big enough that it could potentially hold that much, even if it doesn't actually have that much. So the first statement of Rava sounds like you need a rivi'it of water in a vessel, and the second one just says it has to be big enough that it could hold a rivi'it, but it doesn't actually have to have a rivi'it. Lakashya ha-lechad veha-ha-litrer. There's no contradiction. The first statement is talking about where one person is washing. If only one person is washing, then he has to make sure that there is at least a revi'it of water in the vessel. So because you need a revi'it at least to start off with. You can't do anything without a revi'it. And the Sefer is talking about two people. In other words, as long as you start off with a revi'it, then you can pour half of it on one person, and then the remainder you can pour on the second person. Now, even though from the second person's point of view, he's starting off with a half a revi'it, but that's okay, because as long as you began the process with a revi'it or more, then you can use that amount of water even for 2 people. Tetanya, merevi'it notin yadayim le'echad v'afilu lishnayim, as a Baraita teaches that water, if you have water that is a revi'it, you can use that for 1 person, and you can even use it for 2, even though each person will only get half of a revi'it. Amar le Rav Sheshet Amemar, kaf ditu amana, amar le'in. Rav Sheshet asked Amemar, are you careful about the vessel that you use? You have to make sure it's a whole, intact vessel. It doesn't have holes in it. He says, yes, I do make sure. Achazuta amar le'in. Do you care about the appearance of the water? That should look nice and not be very dirty. He says, yes, I do make sure of that. Ashiura amar le'in. And are you careful that make sure that there's a rivi'it, at least, of water? He says, yes, I make sure of all those things. But there's another version of this conversation where Amemar said that he is careful that the vessel be whole and also that the water look good. However, he is not careful regarding the amount of water that it has to be a revi'it. Detanya, merivit notin le'yadayim le'echad v'afilu le'shnayim. As the Braita says, that a revi'it of water can be used for 1 person. It can even be used for 2 people, which means that one does not require a full revi'it for each person. And so, if a simple reading of this Braita sounds like, a simple reading of this statement sounds like full revi'it is not required. Velahi shanehata mishum dekatu mishiyareta. However, this Baraita is not actually teaching that you don't have to worry about a revi'it, because this is talking about where it's a remainder from an amount that is sufficient for purity. In other words, the Baraita is assuming that you started off with a revi'it, and then as long as you start off with a revi'it, you can use it for 1 person and you can use it for 2 people, because you started off with a revi'it, which is a proper amount. Then you can pour some on one and some on the other person, and that's okay. But this is not a proof for what it would seem according to the Ikad Amre, whereas Amemar says, no, I'm not careful to make sure there is a revi'it in the cup. That sounds like you can even start off with less than a revi'it. However, the Braita does not mean that. Atkin Rav Yaakov ben Nahar Natla bar Revi'ata. Rav Yaakov from Nahar Pekod prepared a glass vessel that can contain a Revi'it. Atkin Rav Asher behusal kuza bat Revi'ita. And Rav Asher Nutzal also made an earthenware vessel that could contain a Revi'it, because they wanted to make sure to have the proper amount of water. ואמר רבא, מגופת חבית שתיקנה נוטלין ממנה לידיים. Rava says that you can take the stopper of a barrel and hollow it out into a vessel and use it for netilat yadayim, as long as it can hold a revi'it, that's okay. Tanyana mehachi megufat chabit shetikena notlim mimenu leyadayim. And there's a braita that also teaches that you can take that stopper of a barrel, like a cork, and hollow it out so that it can hold water, and then you can use it as a netilat yadayim cup. Chemet uchfisha shetikenan notlin mehen layadayim. And you can also take these 2 items that are different types of leather wineskins, and you can use them also for netilat yadayim, since they were made to hold liquids. Sak v'kupa af al pi shemekabelim en notlin mehen layadayim. However, a sack or a basket, like it's woven, even if it could contain enough water, you cannot use that for netilat yadayim, because generally they are leaky. And as we saw before, you cannot use a cup with a hole in it, and therefore a sack and a basket that are not made for holding water and don't do it very well cannot be used. And now the question is, can you skip netilat yadayim altogether if you hold the food with a cloth, and so that your hands are not touching the bread, and that way it doesn't matter if your hands are dirty or not? Is that okay? So we assume technically it would be okay. The question is, are we concerned that a person will end up touching the food? It's very hard to hold the sandwich the whole time in a cloth, and eventually you may touch it by mistake. So therefore we would tell people, no, you have to do netilat yadayim. Or is it okay as long as you're careful to keep keep it in the cloth? Let's try to answer it. Tashema. Uchshenatnu lo l'Rabbi Sadok ochel pachot mikabesa notlo b'mapa v'ochlo chutz l'sukkah. Ve'en mebarech acharav. Let's learn from a Mishnah Masechet Sukkah that when some people gave Rabbi Sadok on Sukkot food and it was less than a kabesa of bread, he did three things that are all leniencies. He took it in a cloth. In other words, he did not do netilat yadayim. And also, because it was less than the kabesa, he ate it outside the sukkah. He thought that as long as it's less than a kabesa of bread, you don't have to sit in the sukkah. He also did not say Birkat HaMazon after it because he felt that you're only satiated v'achalta v'sabata if you have a kabetza at least. And so since it's less, he's not full, and therefore he does not need to say Birkat HaMazon. Ma'alav ha-kabesa ba'en netilat yadayim. Can we infer from this story that were it more than a kabesa or more, then he would have to wash his hands. The only reason why he could follow in leniency and not wash his hands and use a cloth is because it's less than a kabesa, but otherwise you would have to wash your hands and you cannot just use a cloth. Isn't that a good proof? No. Dilma ha-kabesa ba'esuka ba'eberacha. Maybe the point of it being less than a kabesa is to teach that if it were a kabesa, then he would have to sit in sukkah and he would have to say Birkat HaMazon. But maybe the first thing that he did of holding it in a cloth would be possible and permitted even if it were bigger than a kabesa. So no proof from there. Tashema, let's try again. Tishmuel ashkeche lerav dachil b'mapa. Amar le abdin keden. Amar le dati kesara alai. A story about Shmuel who found a Rav who was eating with holding the bread in a cloth. And so he assumed that he did not wash his hands. And so Shmuel asked Rav, can you do that? Are you allowed to just use a cloth and not wash your hands? And Rav says, I am delicate, meaning I don't like touching my food with my bare hands, and that's why I use a cloth. But actually I did wash my hands, netilat yadayim. And therefore, that's not a proof either, because Rav did do netilat yadayim, and in addition, he felt like being clean and not getting his hands dirty, and that's why he used a cloth. Ki sa'alik Rabbi Zera, ashkachinu Rabbi Ameh Rabbi Aseh deka'achli, bibla'eh hamatot. When Rabbi Zera went from Bavel to Eretz Yisrael, he saw that Rabbi Ameh and Rabbi Ameh were eating bread while covering their hands with worn pieces of wineskins, old wineskins, so like leather, and they covered their hands and they ate that way, so not touching the bread. Amar tereh gabre Rabbi kevataychu lita'u b'derav u'Shmuel. And he said, two great sages like you, could you make a mistake regarding the story of Rav and Shmuel? Maybe you misunderstood the story. Ha'dati kesaraka amar. Rav said that the only reason that he's using a cloth is because he's delicate and doesn't like touching food with his bare hands. But he in fact did wash his hands. And now I see the two of you that you are using this worn out leather to hold the food and not washing your hands. Perhaps Rabbi Zera said you didn't understand the point of that story, and you think that that's a precedent to not wash your hands if you're using a cloth. However, the Gemara says, Ish ta mitteha de amar Rav tachlifa bar avimi amar Shmuel. Rabbi Zera must have forgotten that which Shmuel taught. He tiru mapa lochle tiruma velo he tiru mapa lochle teharot. Rabbi Ameh Rabbi Aseh kohanim havu. Shmuel said that one is permitted to use a cloth if it's a person who eats terumah, meaning if it's a kohen, because since a kohen is going to be very, very careful and not touch the terumah, it's okay for him to use a cloth. So a kohen can wash his hands until at the time, but a kohen specifically, if he doesn't do that, he can use a cloth. However, people who have to eat teharot, in other words, sacrificial food, that is not sufficient. Sacrificial food is a higher level than terumah, and therefore, someone who is eating sacrificial food has to make sure to wash his hands and cannot rely on the using of a cloth. And now Rabbi Aseh were kohanim, and so you see they are used to eating terumah, and therefore they will be very careful, and it's okay for them, for sure to use a cloth. So we answer our question at least partially that yes, it's okay to use a cloth as long as you're a kohen. However, there's no proof from here regarding a non-kohen. A question: if someone is eating by means of someone feeding him, so you put your hands on your lap and someone's putting the food in your mouth, and so I'm not touching the food that way, so you still have to do netilat yadayim even though you're not touching the food. Tashema de Rav Huna bar Sechora hava ka'eh Kamed Rav Hamnuna Belamle Umsa Ve'achil. So we have a story of Rav Huna Bar Sechora, and he was standing before Rav Hamnuna. In other words, Rav Huna is the attendant, and he cut a slice of meat for Rav Hamnuna and put it in his mouth, and Rav Hamnuna ate it. Now it says a piece of meat. Now you wouldn't need to netilat yadayim anyway for meat, but we have to assume that it was bread together with meat. This is the first evidence of a sandwich. Amar le'i lav de Rav Hamnuna at safina lach. And Rav Huna said, if not that you were Rav Hamnuna, I would not feed you in this way. Now, why did he say, I wouldn't do this for other people, but only for you? My ta'ama, lav mishum de zahir vela naga, is it not because he knew that Rav Hamnuna would be careful and would not touch the food? And so therefore, as long as one is careful not to touch the food, then that would be a proof that you do not need to do netilat yadayim. Isn't that a good proof then? La dezariz kadim umashe yadeh me'ikara. No, what he meant is, if you were not Rav Hamnuna, and you are very vigilant about mitzvot, and you washed your hands anyway at the beginning, otherwise I would not feed you. In other words, maybe he's saying, I'm only doing this because I know that you will make sure to wash your hands, do netilat yadayim anyway. But for someone else, they'll think that, oh look, someone's feeding me, so I'm not touching it, therefore I wouldn't do netilat yadayim. I wouldn't do this for anybody else because they would end up being lazy and not do netilat yadayim. So therefore, there's no proof from here that even if you're being fed, you don't do netilat yadayim. We could read this, that he's saying, I'm only doing it for you because you did netilat yadayim. Tashema, let's try another proof. Tamar bizera amarav lo yiten adam pirusa letoch piv shel shamash elem ken yodea bo shenatal yadav v'hashamash mevarech al kol kos v'kos ve'eno mevarech al kol perusa uperusa. Rabbi Zera says, name of Rav, that one should not place a slice of bread into the mouth of the attendant unless he knows that the attendant washed his hands. So from that line, it seems that even if you're being fed, you still have to do netilat yadayim. A further law is that the attendant has to bless on every cup of wine that he gets, because he doesn't know if he's going to get the next cup. A regular person who's sitting down for a meal, when you say Borei Pri Gefen at the beginning of the meal, you have in mind this will cover all of the wine that I drink, and it's his free will to decide to pour himself another cup of wine, or have the attendant pour for him another cup of wine. But the attendant himself, it's not his food, and so he is eating only at the discretion and will of the host. And therefore, if the host decides that to give him a cup of wine, so he says a beracha, but he cannot assume that he's going to get another one, and therefore the beracha he says on the first cup does not cover the second cup, and so he has to say another beracha on each one. And similarly, it does not make a blessing on every piece of however, he does not make a blessing on every piece of bread that he gets, because he assumes that he will get more bread, that the host will give him enough to eat. Rabbi Yochanan disagrees and says that the attendant does have to make a blessing for every slice, even for bread. He doesn't know, maybe the host will give him just one piece, maybe two pieces, and therefore he'll have to say Hamos Yelecha Minaris on every piece he gets, because the one name says at the beginning of the meal will not cover that in the subsequent pieces of bread, because he doesn't know if he's going to get them. Amar Papa Bishlama de Rav Rabbi Yochanan lakashya had ikah adam chashuv ha delek adam chashuv. Papa explains that actually we can reconcile the opinions of Rav and Rabbi Yochanan, and Rav was talking about a case where there's an important person at the meal. If there's an important person who's wealthy and generous, he'll make sure to feed the attendant well, and the attendant knows that, and therefore when he says hamotzi at the beginning of the meal, he says, I'm sure I'm going to get more bread, and he will have in mind that will cover the rest of the meal. Whereas Rabbi Yochanan, who said that you have to make a blessing on every piece of bread, was talking about where there's not an important person at the meal, it's just a regular person who we cannot assume will be so generous and may give the attendant, that's it, just one piece of bread and not any more, and therefore he has to say a beracha on every one. In any case, we seem that we do have a proof, because it says you cannot give bread to a attendant unless you know that he washed his hands, and even though the host is feeding him and putting it into his mouth. So isn't that a good proof that if someone is being fed, he still has to do netilat yadayim? And the answer is no. Shaneh shamash titrid. An attendant is different because he is occupied and he may touch the food inadvertently, because he's working and he has to clean the table and bring the food, and he's going to inevitably touch the food, and therefore he has to wash his hands because he is serving food. That's different from a person who's just sitting and being fed by an attendant. That person may not have to wash his hands because we would not assume he's not like a waiter. He's just sitting there, and therefore it could very well be that someone who is being fed does not have to wash his hands. There is no proof in either direction. Tenor banan lo yiten adam perusa la shamash ben shehakos biyado ben shehakos biyado shel baal habayit. Shema yera devar kalkala beseuda. And a baraita that teaches another law about how to treat an attendant, and it says one should not give a slice of bread to the attendant as a guest, meaning the guest should not give it to him. And it doesn't matter whether the cup of wine is in the attendant's hand or in the hand of the host, because either way it might come to a mishap. If it's in the hand of the attendant, then the attendant, while trying to receive this bread in his mouth, may come to spill the wine. And similarly, if it's the cup is in the hand of the host, while he's holding the wine, will see that his guest is feeding the attendant and may object and say, oh, there's not enough food, don't do that. But he's doing that while he is holding the wine, while he's drinking, and they'll try to stop him while he's doing that, and then he may choke or he may spill it, and so therefore do not do that at the same time. And as we said above, if the attendant has not washed his hands, one is not permitted to put a piece of bread in his mouth. Now another question, the person doing the feeding, does he have to wash his hands or not? You could say that he's touching the food. In fact, he's the only one touching the food. The one being fed is not touching it, so therefore maybe he does have to wash his hands. On the other hand, he's not eating, he's just touching the food. You have to wash your hands, netilat yadayim. What if you're just preparing a sandwich for later or for somebody else? Do you have to wash your hands just for that? Tashema detane debe menashe Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel omer isha medicha et yada achat b'mayim venotenet pat libna katan. Amru alav al Shammai hazaken shelo rasa la'achil beyado achat vegazru alav sheyachil b'shtei yadav. So here we have a proof that yes, you would have to wash your hands even if you're not eating yourself, because a baraita from the school of Menashe teaches that according to Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, if on Yom Kippur a woman wants to feed her child bread, she can wash one hand, netilat yadayim, and then she can give bread to her small child. The child doesn't have to fast, but the mother is fasting, and yet she has to wash her hand. And they said about Shammai Hazaken, he wanted to be machmir and not feed his child even with one hand, because he didn't want to wash his hands, because to wash your hands, you have to violate Yom Kippur to wash hands. So the woman is doing it because the child needs to eat. So, okay, that's more important. However, Shammai said, I don't want to do anything at all. I don't want to wash my hands. And therefore, he's going to let his child also have to fast. However, the sages said that's not correct. The child has to eat. And therefore, they made a gezerah that Shammai has to wash both of his hands, kind of as a fine. You don't want to wash one hand? We'll show you how important it is to feed your kids, that you have to wash both hands. Anyway, you see from this story that one is required to wash hands, netilat yadayim, even though he's not eating but only feeding. Amar Abaye says no, not necessarily. It could be that they have to wash hands not as netilat yadayim, that you have to do before bread, but rather because they never wash their hands even from the morning, and that the spirit named shibta, maybe from resting, like shevet, comes upon a person while they're sleeping, and that's why we wash our hands in the morning. And that is why they had to wash their hands before feeding the child, because they never wash their hands in the morning. But perhaps if as long as you wash your hands in the morning and you're only feeding someone, maybe you don't have to wash your hands. So no proof from there. Tashema dabu d'Shmuel ashkeche d'Shmuel dekabache amar le amai kabache. Here's a story about the father of Shemuel, who saw that his child Shemuel, when Shemuel was a young kid, he was crying, and he says, "Why are you crying?" Demachyan Rabbai, and Shemuel, the child, says, "Because my teacher hit me." Amai, why did your teacher hit you? Amarli kasafit librai velamashit yedeh. Because the teacher said to Shemuel, "You're feeding my son." So this teacher had an even younger son, and Shemuel's feeding that little kid, and you did not wash your hands. So why didn't you wash your hands? So he hit him. And then the father said, "And why didn't you wash your hand?" He says, "Because I wasn't eating. This kid is eating. I have to wash my hand." So Shemuel was assuming that one is not required to wash hand if you're only doing the feeding. But the teacher said you do have to. Shemuel's father said, "Amar le la mistayeh de la gamir mimcha nami machaye." Shemuel's father agreed with his son, and he said, "It's not enough that the teacher does not learn halacha, he doesn't know the law, and he even hits you. It's one thing to be ignorant of the law and make a mistake, but he hits you. You have to be really sure before you're going to hit someone based on the law." So he was wrong, and in fact, someone who's feeding someone else does not need to wash hands. Vilchatan, the bottom line is, ochel mechamat ma'achil tzarich netilat yadayim, ma'achil eno tzarich netilat yadayim. Someone who's eating because he's being fed by someone else, he has to wash hands. And someone who's doing the feeding does not have to wash hands. So we see that in the bottom line, it's really the person who is actually doing the eating, whether he's touching or not, has to wash hands. And the person doing the feeding, even though he's definitely touching the food, but he's not eating himself, does not have to do netilat yadayim. Next Mishnah, sorer adam basar ugvina b'mitpachat achat, but shelo yehu nog'in ze bazeh. One is permitted to wrap together meat and cheese in one cloth, as long as they don't touch each other. So just put some layer between the two, but otherwise they can be wrapped together. And we don't worry that someone's going to come and eat them together, because just because they're wrapped, you're going to unwrap them and see that one is meat and one is cheese. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel omer, shnei achsenain ochlin al shulchan echad, ze basar v'ze gimina ve'en choshishin. Rashbag says that two guests at an inn that had like bed and breakfast, so they would, two people that came, and they don't know each other, and now they're sitting at breakfast, and one is eating meat, and one is eating cheese. That's okay. They can sit together at the same table, and they don't have to worry that they're going to eat from each other, because these are two strangers who just happen to be sleeping in the same inn. So they're not going to go and share food. It's not like a husband and wife or friends who are eating together, and then it's natural for them to go and pick from each other's plates without noticing, because they're just, "Oh, that looks good," and they'll just eat it because it's on the table without realizing that one is meat and one is milk. But if it's two strangers and an inn, then it's okay. The Gemara asks, regarding the first case, it says you can wrap two things together as long as they're not touching. It says, well, even if it's touching, so what? If it's cold and cold, so nothing absorbs when it's just cold, so what's the problem? So you're right, you wouldn't have to take off a peel of it, because if one of them is hot and they touch each other, then it's not the whole thing, that's not the whole piece of meat or whole piece of cheese that becomes prohibited, but only the spot where it touched. If one of them is hot, you have to peel it off. So yes, you're right, you would not have to peel it off if it's cold, but you still have to wash it. Even so, if two cold things touch each other, meat and milk, then you do have to wash them. And so if they would touch, you do have to wash them, but we'd rather be careful and not make them not let them touch at all. And that's why we say you can wrap them together, just not let them touch. And if you do it that way, then you're not required even to wash them once you unwrap. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel omer, shnei achsenain ochlin al shulchan. To the second law in the Mishnah of Rashbag, who says that two guests can eat together, one meat and one cheese. Amar Rav Hanan bar Ameh Amar Shemuel lo shanu ela shen makirin ze et ze, aval makirin ze et ze asur. Shemuel says that's only if they don't know each other. But if they do know each other, then it's prohibited, because then they're going to be friends, and then they will just cross over without realizing, oh, I'm eating meat and you're eating cheese. They'll say, oh, that looks like it's a good piece of cheese. And since they're friends, they will eat from each other, so then they cannot eat on the same table. Tanya Mehachi Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel omer, shnei achsenaim shenit'archu lepundak echad, ze ba min hasafon, ze ba min hadarom, ze ba b'chatichato, ze ba b'gvinato, ochlin al shulchan echad, ze basar v'ze gvina ben choshishin. There's a braita that supports what we just said, what Shemuel says here. Says according to Rashbag, if you have two guests that come to the same inn, and one comes from the north and one comes to the south, meaning not from the same place, so they don't know each other, and one comes with his piece of meat and one comes with a piece of cheese, they can sit at the same table and one eat meat and one eat cheese, and there's no worry that they're going to eat from each other. And the only time it's prohibited is if it's in one parcel or one vessel. Now, what do you mean? One vessel? You actually put is anyone going to put cheese and meat together in one vessel? No, it means as if it were one vessel, meaning if they're friends, then it's the same as being in one vessel, even if they're on opposite sides of the table and using two plates. But since they're friends, it's like they're eating out of one vessel, and therefore, if they know each other, it's prohibited. Amar le Rav Yemar bar Shelemia le Abaye, Shnei achin umakpidin ze al ze mahu. Rav Yemar, the son of Shelemia, es Abaye. What if it's two brothers, but they don't like each other, and they are careful not to eat from each other, or they're very picky and germaphobes, and so they would not eat from each other. Since they are careful not to eat from each other, even though they're two brothers and they know each other very well, can one eat meat and one eat cheese on the same table? Amar le yomeru kol hasirikin asurin v'surike baitos mutarin. And Abaye's answer is, you can't make exceptions like that, because for example, will one say that all the decorated Syrian cakes are forbidden, but the Syrian cakes of baitos are permitted? There's a general rule that on Pesach one cannot have decorated cakes because it takes a lot of time to decorate the cakes, and while you're decorating and it's dough, then there's a good chance that while you're spending time decorating it, it will become hametz, and so therefore generally you're not allowed to do that. Now you had this guy Baitos, and he was an expert and very careful, and he said, look, I'll be very careful and I'll decorate it and it won't be chametz. But the rabbi said, no, we can't make exceptions, because we're going to say, oh, all decorated cakes are prohibited, except Baitos, we can't make exceptional rules. And therefore, we have to make a general rule that anytime you know the other person, then you cannot eat meat and milk on the same table. And even if you're particular not to eat from that person who's your brother, still it's prohibited. We make one law across the board. Rav Yemar, however, responds that there are cases where we make an exception to a rule, and look at this exception. It said by Rabbi Aseh, named Rabbi Yochanan, that if a person has only one shirt or one robe, then he's permitted to wash it on Chol HaMoed. On Chol HaMoed, you're not allowed to do the wash. But if a person only has one robe, that's all he has to wear, then he can launder it. Now, why do you make an exception? You just said, once you make a rule, you make it across the board, even if there's someone for whom the rule should not apply. But Rabbi Yochanan says we do make an exception, and for this person, he's allowed to wash his one garment on Chol HaMoed. Why don't you say the same thing? That all people will say, all Syrian cakes, meaning the fancy decorated cakes, are prohibited, except for that of Baitos are permitted. So why don't you say it there also? And his answer is, Hatam ha'amar mor barav ashe ezoro mochiach alav. Mor barav ashe says that the belt will prove it. People generally had more than one robe, but one belt. And while they were washing one robe, they would take off the belt and wash just the robe and wear the belt on the other robe that they had. And so if you see something being washed without a belt, that means the person has another robe. However, if a person only has one robe, so there's no point in taking off the belt because he doesn't have another robe anyway. So therefore, if you see a garment being washed with the robe, with the belt on it, then you know that the owner of this robe only owns one robe. And therefore, no one will get confused and say, oh, well, this person is allowed to wash his robe. I guess everybody's allowed to wash their robes on Chol HaMoed. You don't have to worry about that because the evidence is in the thing itself. And so in a case where it would be clear to everybody that this is an exceptional case, because you could just look at it and see that it's exceptional, then that is permitted to make an exception in such a case. However, with the cakes, when you look at the cake, you don't know who made it, so it's not defined in the cake in and of itself. So in that kind of case, where they all look similar, and then you're just going to make an announcement, oh, you can buy it from this guy's store, but not from another person's store, well, it's not evident what the reason would be. And then people would get confused and think it doesn't make sense that you're making an exception. Baruch Adonai Le'olam, Amen ve'amen.